Would you believe a local council has adopted a limits to growth policy?
Surprise, Donald Trump doesn't like condoms.
U.S. government websites are deleting climate science. And James Hansen warns the UN IPCC is underestimating the amount of global warming we're going to see.
The new Secretary of Energy promises energy dominance and cheap energy. It's drill, baby, drill.
Who are you going to call?
Calling. Call a growth buster. Whoa, whoa, whoa.
You're listening to the Growth Busters podcast. This is the place to get the truth about the unsustainability of unending growth and the scale of the human enterprise.
We can all live beautiful lives on a healthy planet. Thanks for joining us and for sharing this podcast to help us bust the myth of prosperity from growth. I'm Dave Gardner, director of the documentary Growth Busters, Hooked on Growth, and senior counselor here at the Center for Growth Addiction Recovery.
And I'm Stephanie Gardner, Growth Busters advisor and board member, environmental law and policy fanatic, and sustainable energy devotee. Learn more and subscribe to Growth Busting updates at growthbusters.org.
And pitch in so we can keep podcasting. Find the donate link at our website or in this podcast's show notes. Well, there's a lot of growth-busting news to get through. Stephanie, are you ready to rock and roll?
Yeah, lay it on me.
Sorry, try to include some good news in here where we find it. First of all, we're recording this on February 9th, and just this last week, James Hansen and 17 other scientists at the Columbia University Earth Institute released a paper that makes the case that the UN IPCC climate projections are underestimating the cooling effect of aerosols. And therefore, as we clean up the air, we're getting much faster warming than anticipated. Now, this isn't the first time you've seen news about that, but these guys have really done the hard data analysis and are making a really strong case for this. You're aware, Stephanie, I imagine, that less solar radiation is being reflected away from the Earth, and a big part of that is because some of the really dangerous air pollution that the shipping industry has been responsible for has really been cut back. The sulfur aerosol pollution from ships dropped 70% starting in 2020 when significant limits were imposed by the International Maritime Organization. So that's really good news in terms of cleaning up the air and eliminating some premature deaths. But it turns out that all of that dirty pollution was actually slowing down the warming of the climate.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Some of our bad behaviors were actually delaying some of the impacts of the increased CO2 in the atmosphere. So this is pretty crazy to think about.
Yeah, so that explains, was it El Nino or La Nina recently was part of the explanation for some really significant acceleration of warming just in the last couple of years.
I think it was El Nino, but then was it that El Nino was actually not even as strong as it could have been? It was like a weaker El Nino, I think I remember reading.
So it didn't really explain the accelerated warming that we've seen the last couple of years. And Hansen will be the first to tell you that we're probably not going to stay at that accelerated rate. That rate of decline in aerosol pollution isn't going to continue. So anyway, global average temperature is increasing at a higher rate than IPCC assumptions. That ain't good news, baby. I'm interrupting this podcast for just a few seconds to extend an invitation. Stephanie and I would like to know what you're thinking, like how you growth bust and what kind of help you need from us. Help us figure out how we can all be more effective growth busters. Please take the survey we've designed for you. It takes less than 2 minutes. Find a link to the survey in the show notes. Thanks. Meanwhile, changing the subject, Elon Musk and Donald Trump are trying to dissolve the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID. And that's interesting to me, especially because that executive order calling for a 90-day freeze on foreign aid and the attempts to just completely eliminate that agency are crippling life-saving humanitarian aid programs around the world that rely on USAID funding and staff. And that includes family planning, reproductive and maternal health, but it also includes other kinds of aid to war zones in Ukraine and Sudan and elsewhere. So it's bad news all around. But I wanted to highlight it because one component of the aid is family planning, and we really champion family planning and reproductive health. the expense of providing contraception and good family planning advice and support is really tiny compared to the cost of taking care of unplanned and unwanted children.
Yeah, this is pretty devastating news, not to mention all of the people working at incredible NGOs around the planet trying to get, medicine and resources to people that are less fortunate.
Yeah, this is a mean era.
Losing their livelihoods and all of that, having the rug pulled out from under them. NPR put out a little piece on what is USAID for people that aren't as familiar. I found it kind of interesting that it was created in 1961 by President John F. Kennedy. And it was really, the purpose was, as one of the wealthiest countries on the planet, JFK thought that we had a moral and financial obligation to provide foreign aid. In addition, there were some other political motivations around ensuring that democratic governments had support and totalitarianism wasn't going to be taking over certain parts of the U.S. So it's a very complex thing, this idea of the U.S. providing resources to different countries, but also separating out our military efforts abroad with non-military efforts. And so USAID falls into that second category. And regardless of how we feel about the U.S.'s involvement in global socio-political dynamics, to me, what Trump's doing and his administration is doing is just very clearly acting on this ethos of America first. And more for us, we don't care what the impact is on anyone else around the planet. We're going to do anything we can to enrich ourselves the most, make ourselves the richest, wealthiest country, and screw everyone else. And I just hope that people think about what that really means and what our country is becoming as a result of that ethos. It's very, very frightening to me.
Yeah, it really is complete defiance of Christian principles of loving one another and putting other people first. It seems like we're operating under the wrong golden rule. Trump's golden rule, of course, is he who has the gold makes the rules. And that seems to be where we are.
Yeah, and it represents less than 1% of our budget. It's a small fraction of our budget compared to a lot of other things like the military. So just food for thought. Not
to necessarily push the selfish part of the agenda, but it is in our best interest to help everyone around the world, including here at home, to eliminate unintended pregnancies. Having a lot of unintended pregnancies and births is bad news for all of us. It's bad news for the climate because those are a lot of climate emitters that could have been avoided with good reproductive health care.
Absolutely.
And of course, on that same subject, this is on top of his January 24th reinstatement of the global gag rule, which was expected. And that rule restricts U.S. foreign assistance to organizations that provide counseling or advocating for legal abortion services, among many other reproductive health services, regardless of local laws or non-U.S. funding sources. So it just sort of is a sweeping elimination of funding just because there might be some abortion counseling or service as a part of the mix in there, even if it's not getting U.S. funding. The initial introduction of the global gag rule was by the Reagan administration in 1984, and Democratic administrations have reversed the rule every time they come into power, and Republican administrations have reimposed it. It's just a seesaw, and it's a sad one. And in truth, we should be providing free contraception globally, including right here in the U.S.
Well said. Couldn't agree more.
Next on our list, the Senate confirms fossil fuel CEO Chris Wright as Energy Secretary, and he vows to unleash U.S. resources. Wright is CEO of the Denver-based Liberty Energy and has been one of the industry's loudest voices against efforts to fight climate change. And here he is at the January 15th Senate confirmation hearing.
I see 3 immediate tasks where I will focus my attention if I get the privilege of being confirmed. The first is to unleash American energy at home and abroad to restore our energy dominance. The security of our nation begins with energy. Previous administrations have viewed energy as a liability instead of the immense national asset that it is. To compete globally, we must expand energy production, including commercial nuclear and liquefied natural gas and cut the cost of energy for Americans.
It's pretty astonishing to me that people like Wright and Donald Trump and most members of the Republican Party aren't embarrassed to be talking about energy dominance and cheap energy in the era of the climate crisis. What planet are they living on?
They obviously are trying to write climate change out of the history books, and they don't seem to think that it's going to impact them. And who cares about everyone else on the planet? Although it obviously does impact people in the U.S. We just saw all of the fires in the Los Angeles area on the wake of the hurricanes that hit the southeastern United States. Like, it's so in our faces every week, and you can't just pretend like it doesn't exist. So the shit is going to hit the fan again and again, and people are going to realize what's going on, and they're going to vote in, hopefully, a new government that takes it seriously.
Well, we're trying to help people connect the dots here, so you probably know somebody who needs to hear about this, so share this podcast. Maybe we can get through, but it's not easy. You know, we need to go on an energy diet. We should pay attention to the cost of transporting people where they need to go. We don't want to make it so that people cannot move about when it's really necessary. But eliminating price signals about the climate disruption caused by burning more fossil fuels, that's just not the way to do it. Very counterproductive. Another thing that astonished me is that 8 Democrats, including Colorado's 2 Democratic senators, voted to approve his appointment. You know, and this isn't a political podcast, and we're not pro-Democrat and anti-Republican. In fact, you know, this is just one more example of Democrats who, for some reason, are putting something ahead of the health of our climate, some deal making or something. They obviously think that supporting an energy secretary from Colorado is going to somehow, you know, financially benefit the state over the next 4 years, would be my guess.
Yep. We've talked a lot recently about how the Democrats aren't doing the right thing when it comes to climate change and energy policy. It's just been missing from the conversation in recent time.
You bet your booties, Granny. So next up, the USDA and Forest Service were ordered to remove climate change references from websites, and it's also been largely scrubbed from the White House website. Big surprise. Trying to rewrite science and rewrite history.
And climate change isn't the only thing, right? They're removing, I keep reading headlines about CDC and medical advice and help. And I think this next one falls into that category, where they've taken down a website that the Biden administration actually published right after the decision came down around access to abortion, you know, the Roe decision. And this website had all kinds of resources about, you know, in the wake of that decision, what access to reproductive resources, medical advice, medications available, et cetera. What could you still do in the wake of that decision? And, you know, Trump's administration has taken that website down. Yeah,
it was reproductiverights.gov and vanished. So, you know, a couple of heroes, a couple of ladies, Carly Zakin and Danielle Weisberg, noticed that, and they made it available again. They created a new website and posted that content at reproductiverights.gov.com. The only period in there is right before com. Everything else is words. Reproductiverights.gov. Those are all words. And then period, com. They made that information available. Bravo to them.
Yes, big bravo.
And I should give them a little bit more credit. They run this website called The Skim, which is a nonpartisan media organization dedicated to succinctly giving women the information they need to make confident decisions. So thank you, ladies.
Mutual aid is, I think, going to be the way to go the next 4 years.
Yeah, big topic of conversation.
Help each other out.
Yeah, here on the podcast and just among my neighbors is, what do we do? If the federal government is paralyzed, there's still a lot of places where we can be doing the right thing and try to make up for lost time. Meanwhile, Trump administration attempts to halt $50 million in international aid for condoms. And this is
this is too good.
This is the humor.
This is so ridiculous.
Let's listen to new press secretary Carolyn Leavitt at a White House briefing.
Doge and OMB also found that there was about to be 50 million taxpayer dollars that went out the door to fund condoms in Gaza. That is a preposterous waste of taxpayer money.
Trump repeated the claim and added some additional detail.
In that process, we identified and stopped $50 million being sent to Gaza to buy condoms for Hamas. 50 million. And you know what's happened to them? They've used them as a method of making bombs. How about that?
I think they forgot to hire a fact checker.
Yeah, and there's a couple of somewhat conflicting or non-overlapping explanations of all this, because apparently we did send condoms to the Gaza province in Mozambique through the Elizabeth Glaser Pediatric AIDS Foundation. It wasn't $50 million worth, but someone at the White House may have misread a spreadsheet and come up with this Gaza connection. Or it could be this other story, which is, according to State Department spokesperson Tammy Bruce, the administration halted $102 million that was headed to the International Medical Corps, a U.S.-based organization that operates 2 field hospitals in Gaza. The IMC stated that none of their U.S. government funding was used to procure or distribute condoms. And so I was digging into this a little bit more. I was curious about, well, how do you make a bomb with a condom?
No kidding.
There's one bomb you avoid. You avoid the population bomb.
You're going to have to add that joke to your repertoire, Dad, at like parties and such.
And isn't it funny? That wasn't in the script. My best stuff just pops up.
It's a talent. It's a true talent.
Somebody stop me. Hold me back. But digging into that a little bit, Snopes does tell us that there were reports in 2020 that Palestinians in Gaza were filling condoms with refrigerant gas to float incendiary devices to blow into Israel. So they were using them as balloons, which is sort of a long-standing condom gag. Total worldwide USAID condom spending is far less. Total global spending by the U.S. is far less than $50 million. In the 2023 fiscal year, USAID provided or funded a global total of about $7 million worth of male condoms and about $1 million worth of female condoms, overwhelmingly to countries in Africa, according to a federal report. So I just want to say again, condoms are cheap compared to the cost of caring for unwanted children, the cost of attempting to mitigate consequences of human overpopulation. We should be providing long-term and short-term contraception globally for free. It's the right thing to do. It's the best thing to do for our kids to have a healthy planet. And it's economically sensible to do because it is a lot cheaper than paying the financial consequences of not doing that.
Yep. In fact, it's so cheap, I think you were able to pull up information that in bulk, they cost about 5 cents each. So $50 million worth is about 1 billion condoms. So if we had sent 50 million condoms to the Gaza, right next to Israel, where the Palestinian people live, that would be about 475 condoms for every single Gazan person.
Man, those guys must be really busy if they need those. But yes. That kind of pisses me off because if you go down to the local drugstore here in the U.S., those condoms aren't a nickel apiece.
That's true. They are actually kind of pricey.
Dang it. Real quick, I don't want to belabor this, but I want to mention that the District of Tofino Council in Canada voted in December to approve a policy called the Limits to Growth Policy. Now, this policy aims to ensure a sufficient water supply during the summer months when tourism and dry conditions create a challenge. It's intended to manage development in Tofino over the next 5 to 10 years, allocating water consumption based on development priorities that are contained in planning documents, such as the official community plan. So it's kind of a short-term, they think it's kind of a short-term thing in order to give them time to figure out, some new water sources, which is sort of sad, and that's not worthy, I don't think, of the Limits to Growth title. But I just wanted to mention it because it's pretty amazing that they had the audacity to call it the Limits to Growth policy.
Yeah, this is really cool. I enjoyed looking into this. It's really common sense. The key policy information states that, all new developments must maintain a water allocation certificate before receiving a building permit. What a concept. We're only going to build to match the water we have. And we're not going to start building and then figure out the water afterward. This is really cool. And I really can't leave this topic without highlighting that I didn't look deeply into this, but part of the community is an indigenous First Nation, the Claukit First Nation. And one cool thing about the policy is that it divides the water allocation and who is going to be determining the allocation and receiving the allocation. It's actually divided by two entities, the Claukit First Nation and then non-First Nation people.
Yeah.
So I have to believe that the fact that this indigenous community is involved in and lives there is influencing how this is going about. And it reminded me of our conversation about Robin Wall Kimmerer on the last episode and her new book. And there's just a lot that we can learn from the First Nation peoples. So I thought that this was a really cool example of that in practice.
Yeah, it's just critical to me. I'm going to say clearly they still can't imagine an end to growth.
Yeah.
They can imagine a temporary halt. They can imagine maybe saner growth, maybe smart growth,
Yeah.
maybe slower growth. They can't imagine maybe we're done with growth.
Yeah.
So I know we've skipped listener feedback a time or two because we were running some long episodes, but we do really want to share a little bit. There's two interesting things that we've heard recently. One was we got some pretty good feedback to our idea of the book club. So let's talk offline, and in an episode soon we'll launch that idea where we'll all read a book, and maybe it'll be Robin Kimmerer's book. Not quite ready to start that.
So we received an email from Robert Bowman. He writes, "Hi, Dave and Stephanie. My optimism is based on the knowledge that this whole global corporate juggernaut will not last. Sustainability is not optional. Whatever we don't do voluntarily, we will do involuntarily. Period. I like to do a silly Clint Eastwood impression and say, what's it going to be, punk? Are we going to do this the easy way or the hard way? Regretfully, it appears that humankind's transition to sustainability will be 90% involuntary. At a time when we need bold, visionary leadership, we have nothing of the sort. We have delusional clowns and narcissistic sociopaths. Just look at how the Democrats recently managed to be defeated by an arrogant, racist, sexist, grotesquely narcissistic sociopath buffoon who, unlike 2016, is now a convicted felon and sex offender. May God help us. Dave, I too have considered running for president, but then never once even hearing about your campaign, I'm further reminded of what is stacked against anyone actually willing to say worthy things. I do believe, though, that if a worthy candidate could gain traction, there would be a plurality of Americans who would be receptive to the reality facing civilization. It is, after all, irrefutable science. I would tell dissenting voices, you are entitled to your own opinions, but you don't get to select your own laws of physics, and then steamroll them with science. But then, alas, worthy voices aren't allowed to rise to the point of being heard.
Thanks, Robert. We love hearing from you, and we will attempt to share the most interesting feedback on the next episode of the Growthbusters podcast. So if you have something to say, you can email us, podcast@growthbusters.org, or you can write a comment at this episode's page on the Growthbusters website, growthbusters.org, or you can leave us a voice message and we'll actually play your lovely words to the public. Call 719-402-1400 to leave a message. Well, listen, having intelligent conversations about overshoot really is important. So I've said it before, I'll say it again. Please share this episode with people you love or anyone who needs to learn about limits to growth or ecological overshoot. That can include your mayor, your governor, senator, prime minister, president, journalists.
In-laws. Not speaking about anyone in particular. Be sure to follow the podcast on your podcast app so you don't miss an episode.
And check out the Growthbusters online community at groups.io.
A big thanks to Jake Fader for writing and producing the Growthbusters theme you hear at the open and close of this podcast, and to Carlos Jones for singing it.
Learn more about the issues we discuss in this podcast at growthbusters.org.
That's also where you can donate or get on our email list.
Well, thanks for listening, sharing, and doing your part. We have a planet to save.
Some may dream to pave mountains and streams, but not me. I'm a growth buster. Some may just want more, but don't know what it's for, but not me. I'm a growth buster. Don't want a solution at the cost of pollution. They think bigger is better at the cost of the weather. But no, not us. We are the growth busters. Calling, 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 calling. Call the growth busters.